Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Let's Talk Assassin's Creed, your number one podcast for all things Assassin's Creed. In today's episode, we are going to be looking at the evolution of combat. Now, we have done evolution of the games in the past, where we looked at how the games have evolved from a linear, story perspective style game to a now more RPG, open world based system. And along the way, we've seen combat evolve from Assassin's Creed 1's basic arcadey style combat to Odyssey and Origins Hitbox traditional RPG mechanics. Now, when I say arcade style for Assassin's Creed combat, I'm not knocking the combat, because the combat at the time worked really well. But it wasn't very button mashy. Well, it wasn't places, but it wasn't a sort of system where you had to move around the battlefield, you had to use a combination of light and heavy attacks. Now, from what I remember playing some of the old games, the only combat that seemed worthwhile doing was always counter, then insta-kill. The square button on PlayStation, which was the normal attack button, didn't feel very weighty. I think when I play Assassin's Creed 3 Remaster, I could spam the square button to attack, but it doesn't feel like I'm doing as much damage as if it would if I just wait for the right time to press circle to counter, and then go for an insta-kill. Now, as the games have evolved, I couldn't see this system working. Now, if you played Odyssey and you were in a boss battle and you relied on a system where you didn't need that much reaction time just to counter and then kill, it would make the battles less interesting. There would be a basic system of wait, parry, kill, and it would be done in seconds. Now, when you play the older games, it is kind of interesting to see this combat work, because you could get about 10 enemies in a row and just wait to counter an insta-kill. Chain that together, and you have some of the most impressive fight sequences in video games. But after Black Flag, it seemed they took a new direction with Unity. Unity evolved the game as an open-end experience, and with an open-end experience, they involved combat. Now, Unity's take on combat is a very basic RPG that I enjoy, but at the same time, I feel it has no weight to it, similar to the old style combat. There is a parry system, and it does look like they have tuned down the reaction time between the parry system and the old parry system. And now, what I mean by reaction time, I do feel that you don't need very much muscle memory to remember to quickly press circle, whereas games like Dark Souls, you need to have that memory to quickly press the counter button to parry perfectly. But the window between you reacting and you countering in the old games seems very lenient. I think most games are probably milliseconds. If you mess up in the milliseconds, you've screwed up the parry. But I do feel in the old games it's mere seconds, maybe 1 or 2 seconds to hit that counter button, and it makes it very easy. Now, Unity has a very different parry system. It's not a parry and insta-kill, it is a fencing style approach. You parry and it just deflects the blow, and then you've got to go in for a basic attack. And this makes the combat feel more grounded and realistic, because I couldn't see an assassin like Ezio or Altair or Connor or even Edward standing around waiting for someone to hit them. As an assassin, you would expect them to own the battlefield. You'd expect them to, if they get into that one-on-one situation, to use the area to their advantage. Maybe a smoke bomb to get away in stealth. But if it boils down to hand-to-hand combat, you wouldn't expect them to be, okay, I'll stand here and I'll wait. Now, I know there is gameplay mechanics involved behind the combat where the enemies come in a bit later. I think that's to make the combat last longer. Whereas if they all just rush you at once, it can be chaos and you probably die if you have 10 enemies attacking. But in a real life scenario, if we imagine the memories as reality instead of just a fictional game, you couldn't see Altair doing this either, just standing there, wait till guard X attacks. He's going to rush, he's going to deflect the blow, maybe use the hidden blade as a counter system, and then attack and continue. And when you do this in the old games, it does feel that way when you chain the count system, but it's just a basic 2-button prompt. As I refer to Unity, this isn't the case. If you're in a crowd of 10 and you just rely on hitting counter, you're not going to really do anything. You're just going to keep hitting it, and the enemy is just going to keep running at you. So you have to counter, attack, dodge. Counter, attack, dodge. It's a very basic system for a gameplay of combat, but it does feel more evolved than the original combat. And it also makes combat sometimes more infuriating or challenging, because if an enemy is shooting at you, you can't just... Well, you can use a body shield, but you can't just use body shield, deflect, run, counter. You have to then go for a proper deflect, run, enter combat phase, essentially do a few hits with your attack button. But if the enemy is high level, you are going to probably get squished. Now, the game that kind of evolved combat in a weird way, but worked, has to be Syndicate. Now, Syndicate's combat is very strange in my eyes. It's very reminiscent to melee combat from games like the Batman series. It's very much combo based, and as we see in games from Shadow of Mordor and the Batman series, when you get to a certain number in your counter system, you enter a near death state, as it's called in the game, which pretty much is an insta-kill. It's a very weird mechanic, and for the time, I can believe it. Syndicate's set in the 1800s. I couldn't see them walking around with swords and daggers. I can understand the hidden blade, but or a cane sword, that kind of fits really well. But I couldn't see them with a full-on Excalibur-style sword in the scabbard. So having a melee-oriented combat with brass knuckles or mini daggers called kunai, I can get that as believable, and the counter system does work for the Backstreet style vibe. But I just don't think how it plays out is kind of grounded. It feels kind of arcadey. It's good because it gets the job done in combat, but it just kind of feels too arcadey. The final fact you've just got to combo everything to get to the end game. I kind of prefer Unity's approach first, because at least the combat felt faster. But Syndicate's felt more button mashy for combos, and if you get hit and you mess up the combo, then really you don't get to these near death states as quick, and it just kind of loses the vibe of bad ass assassin that can do serious damage. And then we go to Origins and Odyssey, and they just blew it all out of the water. They just looked at the combat and went, let's do something different. Their combat is a true RPG hitbox system, with a light and a heavy attack that you've got to combo as best as possible. Along with the combo, you've got to try and dodge and parry with your shield. The parry times for this game has been greatly reduced, but Odyssey, I feel it's been increased, because I feel in Odyssey I can parry more than I could in previous games, which I don't like. I want my combat to feel engaging and meaty, not just I'll stand here and parry everything. Now we're not going to go over the abilities or the adrenaline system. We're just going to look at the combat itself, because the adrenaline and the ability system is an extension of the combat, but that leans more into the RPG mechanics that was added. The combat itself, if you take away all these abilities, especially in Odyssey, is a quite decent combat system, but I think in Odyssey especially it can be a bit spongy when you attack your enemies. This is something I recently discovered, and I've been playing a lot more of Odyssey, and I can see it. Now in Origins, I kind of like the approach of Hitbox, because it makes me feel how an assassin would fight. I could see an assassin like Altair or Ezio fighting the Borgias or the Templars on the Crusade, this style, over a style where you just stand in a crowd and press circle and then counter, then attack. Now, The issue with this style at first is some of the enemies, especially in Odyssey, become damage sponges. So you can just keep hacking away the health bar and you just feel like it's not working. You may feel like the light attack is not as powerful as it should be, and the heavy attack isn't really a heavy attack. In Origins I didn't experience this much. I think the combat was fluid. I did kind of enjoy this new approach, and dodging around a battlefield to counter your enemies did feel nice. It felt really satisfying to engage with an enemy, to deflect the shield, and then kill them off in some glorious style where you're on the floor or something. This, to me, feels fluid. It feels like how an RPG combat should be. However, with Odyssey, the combat's fun. Some people say floaty. I don't really understand that reference, but to me, I can see how enemies come off as spongy. The more I play and the more I tamper weapons, I can see in certain scenarios, even though the combat is the same as Origins, the enemy system is a bit more spongy, but the combat seems to be a tiny bit tighter. I feel more responsive with my heavy and my light than I did in Origins, but again the parry system feels quicker. So overall it looks like combat's done a really steep evolution to Origins, but then Odyssey kind of just pauses. It does everything right with Origins combat, but tries to amplify it with more flashy RPG mechanics. This isn't bad, because the game works really well for what it does, but I just wish the reaction time for parry system was a bit shorter, because to be able to parry everything just makes you feel superhuman. And then the final evolution of combat will be Valhalla. But we can't say what Valhalla's combat will be at the moment, because we haven't played the game, because it's not out yet. Sadly, I wish it was. Now, from what we know from the directors and other game developers and testers, Valhalla's combat is meant to feel more visceral, more heavy, more weighty, and more aggressive for the approach. Now, how this will play off is yet to be determined, but I'm hoping it's a tighter version of Origins, where the light and heavy attacks feel dead weighty, got some weight to it when you swing your axe, and I do hope that the parry system in this game is tighter. I don't want to be fighting a horde of 10 Anglo-Saxons and finding it really simple to parry a sword or parry a shield attack. I'm very curious to see how combat's going to evolve this time around, because when we look at combat in all the games, one thing they've had in common is they always have a single blade system. Now, I do know that in some games you can use guns. Free and Rogue and Black Flag could use guns, so you could use the bayonet system to shoot and stab. But a lot of times it has just been a basic sword, or in Black Flag's case, dual wielded swords. But this time it's different because any weapon can be used in combat. Dual wielded shields, dual wielded axes. I think someone mentioned dual wielded double-handed weapons, which could be intriguing. So I'm curious to see how they're going to evolve combat to incorporate these sort of elements, because trying to do Origins approach with two shields kind of will feel a bit odd. I don't know how we're supposed to do damage with a shield, but it is yet to be seen. So one of the biggest questions I'm left with is how can they evolve combat? And I don't think they should. I personally think combat has evolved to where it needs to be. For the type of game they're heading for in the RPG, I think combat should stay how it will be in Valhalla. If Valhalla is an improvement of Origins, then that's how the combat should stay. Now obviously, as the time zones changes, you will need to evolve combat to fit the time zone, but I think that's just more to the style. So if we went to feudal Japan, I could see a Ghost of Tsushima style gameplay with a samurai, maybe a bit more ninja style because that would fit more. If you went back to Renaissance Italy for Rome, I could see you doing more of an Ezio style combat but not using the old count system, which would kind of be interesting to see how a roam game would play with this new style of combat. But I do think combat should stay how it is. I adore the old system combat. It's one of my favourite combats for the time, but in an open world system that they are heading, I just don't think their system would fit. A parry and instant kill system in a game as big as Origins, Honors, and Valhalla would feel out of place with the type of enemies. If you're versing a boss fight, I know it may seem contradictory because I am mixed on the one-shot assassinations on bosses, but a one-shot parry and kill on bosses isn't something that feels right. If you're going into a fight with a boss with a sword and a shield, it shouldn't be as simple as 2 seconds to counter and kill. I just think it needs to be more weighty, more reasoned, more grounded. And I think as we look at Assassin's Creed and we look at the idea of the games becoming grounded in history, and I think it should be accepted to have combat grounded in reality as well. And the old games never achieved grounded reality combat. Their combat was too gamey and arcadey for the time, and it worked, but it wasn't grounded in history. And I know I'm going to get a lot of comments about how this game is just a game and it's just fictional, but I like to see a game that does pride itself on being a real history, following historical accuracy as best as possible. Unity did well using a fencing style approach. I believe that did fit with the time period. Syndicate's backstreet style brawl system fitted perfectly for running gangs and industrial London. Origins and Ozzy's combat fit for their type of gameplay. Origins, I've got what's it called now? A Magi. And a Magi, you're going to want to be very versatile in hand-to-hand combat. Odyssey, I can't pronounce the word, Mistius, and I think your combat should be as varied as possible. With the added spear of Leonidas, it kind of made combat a bit more flashy, but I wouldn't count that as combat because I do think that's more lenient on the RPG mechanics. So, thank you all for tuning in for this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. A sneak peek of what's to come next week will be dropped on Patreon on Monday. And as always, you can get early access to next week's episode 3 days before its official release.